You might need to do a different sort of like self-soothing intervention, sleep training with them that does not exacerbate the problem. When we're new moms, we question every single thing that we're doing and we're wondering like, am I a bad mom for doing it this way? If you tried one method one night and you're like, oh, that doesn't work, and then you try a different method a different night and they're like, oh, that doesn't work, because you're not responding the same way as a parent, it ends up confusing them to know what they can expect or trust. You can adjust any method to your own liking. Follow your motherly parental instincts. So today's question is, how do you sleep train your child and help them self-soothe, especially if you don't want to go through the whole cry it out method? I was having a conversation recently with a couple of other mom friends of mine. I had this expectation that I was just like, oh, well, once I figure out what method we're going to use, like that will be the method I use with both of my kids. And that was not the case. I used one method for one child and it was a completely different method for another. And sometimes, even though we know like, oh, our kids have different personalities and oh, they're just like, a unique person, that we just kind of think within our own brains that like, oh, this is the parenting choice that we're making, and so we're just going to be consistent and this is how it's going to be with every single aspect of our parenting. And once we get into the actual like experience of parenting our kids, we realize, oh, our kids are completely different. Maybe this isn't going to work. And through my discussion of like sleep training with these other two moms, they both were kind of like, well, what do you mean when you say your kids cry up or they cry down? So we're going to get into all of that today because I think this is a really important nuance to bring to the conversation. But if we haven't hung out before, my name is Brianna. I do have two cowboys, and most of the time we talk about either money or mom life here on this channel, and today is definitely a mom topic. So if you are ready to sleep train your child, I definitely had one variable I think that was very challenging in the situation that my mom friends were in, and that was they were still sleeping with their kids in the same room. And from my experience, because I also tried to sleep train with my youngest being in the same room as me, that it was not successful to sleep train and help him learn the skill of self-soothing while we were in the same room, because he would just be at the crib like yelling and crying and screaming, looking at me, right? He could see like, Mom, I'm calling your name, right? In the only way that they can communicate, which is cry. And yet there I am, sitting or lying there in my bed being non-responsive. So I do feel like the biggest variable in helping your child be successful with sleep training or self-soothing is for them to be in a completely separate space, right? Because when you are there, they rely on you to help self-regulate their emotions. And so if you're not responding to their needs, that's essentially just basically communicating to them that you don't care about them. They cannot trust you to take care of them. At least that is my perception. This is why I feel like it is very challenging. And if you know someone, or if you yourself had experience where it was successful to sleep train your child while you also shared the same room, I would be very interested to hear that perspective. But from my experience, that was not the case with both of my sons when I went through this process. So I do feel like the best variable that provides the best success when it comes to sleep training is them being in a separate room or separate space from you. Let's talk about different sleep training self-soothing techniques. So there's a couple of different options out there, and I'm sure that you can go and research all of them. But I would say that the one that is probably the most controversial is the cry out method. And that is of course where you just put your kid to bed, they're, changed, they're fed, all of their main needs are already met. And you just basically say okay, if they're crying, then they're going to cry and I'm not going to respond to them. And I am not a proponent of this method. I personally feel like if you're just leaving your child there for a great amount of time, that it is creating distrust in your child to know that even if they can't mentally perceive that this is what's happening, is you're basically abandoning them because they don't know any different, right? So the method that I actually preferred to use was being a very tell me what to do. I will follow the instructions to the T. Like, I just need someone to tell me what I need to do for my child. I really gravitated towards the Ferber method, which, depending on the age of your child, will depend on like when you should start utilizing this method. But I will also just want to caveat that with, you are the parent. Whenever you decide you is right for you to sleep train or help your child self-soothe, like, follow your motherly parental instincts, okay? And you can adjust any method to your own liking, to your own standards, right? You have that authority as the parent to say like, I really like aspects of this method, or I really like aspects of this method, so I'm going to pair it together and make my own method, right? Like, that is one of the great things about being a mom, is we kind of get to choose and pick what's going to make sense for us and what we feel is appropriate for our child. So I kind of did something very similar with the Ferber method, which is basically where you give your child certain very set intervals of time where you say, okay, I'm not going to respond to any cries or any fussing until this certain metric of time has passed. And then that time increases over the course of days or weeks, depending on how you choose to implement it with your child. So your child essentially learns the ability to self-soothe from your absence, but also has that reassurance that you are coming back to them to care for them and make sure that they are safe, comfort them, basically like let them know that you're not abandoning them, but gives you very specific intervals of time for you as a parent to follow. Because like, let's just face it, like when we're new moms, we question every single thing that we're doing, and we're wondering like, am I a bad mom for doing it this way? And it was just nice to know that, okay, an expert has put together these intervals of time that I can follow, and I know I'm not a horrible mom if I do this, because tons of other people have followed this method and their kids still grew up to be fine functioning adults. So what that looked like for me when to kind of like create a variance in the Ferber method schedule that I felt was best for my family and for my son when we were going through this period of time, was that I looked at the intervals of time that we were supposed to use. And I think, and again, because it has been so long, and because I am a big advocate of making it work for your family, I don't know if it's like, oh, these are the intervals you do and then you change the intervals each day or not, or if it's like every 3 days. Like, you make it fit for what you are comfortable with. But I think I took like the first interval, which was like, you lay them down and you reassure them, you say goodnight, you do your normal routine, and then at 5 minutes you go in. If they're fussing, you go in and you reassure them, and then you wait another like 7 minutes, and then you go in and you reassure them, and then you go up to like 10 minutes, and then you go in and you reassure them. And then it like gives you certain metrics for you to go in and basically recheck on your child if they haven't self-soothed to the point where they can fall asleep. And for me, because I was like, okay, I like the system of what this method is teaching. I'm just not super thrilled with the intervals at the age and stage that my child was, or what I felt like was best for us and our fit for our family. I just adjusted that to okay, we were going to do these intervals for a week, and then we'll do the next intervals for the next week. My first son, he cried down. And if in my discussion with these moms, I was saying like, oh yeah, my first son, he cried down, but my second son, he cried up. And then I had to use a completely different method with him. And they just kind of stopped me and like, what do you mean when he cried down or he cried up? So with my first son, he cried down, meaning that when he cried, his cries ended up getting quieter and quieter and quieter and quieter. So he essentially cried himself to the point where like he self-soothed himself to sleep, to a point where he ended up becoming more relaxed. Whereas with my second son, he cried up, where his cries got more and more and more and more intense, to the point where he ended up kind of like hyperventilating. So some kids, you may hear of some kids where like they cry so hard that they end up passing out, or they turn blue or purple. Like, those kids are crying up, okay? And you might need to do a different sort of like self-soothing intervention, sleep training with them that does not exacerbate the problem. And so this is why I felt like I had to use use a completely different technique with my second son because he cried up to the point where it's like, okay, he is not crying down, where like maybe their cries first start like really soft, but then they, like with my first son, like because even when he cried down, sometimes like he would start crying and he would like, you could hear the intensity get louder and get like longer, but then it would like it would subside as I would go in, I would check on him, I would reassure him, which we'll talk about like what did that look like for him in a second. But with my second son, when he cried up, it just got more and more intense. And every time I would go and try and reassure him and check on him and like comfort him, it would escalate to the point where I was like, okay, you are not getting to the point where you feel confident and safe and secure that you can essentially like calm yourself down. Like you need me as your parent to help you regulate your emotions. Whereas with my first son, he did not necessarily need me to, like, once he felt calm and secure that I was responding to his needs and he felt safe because of how I was coming in and checking on him and reassuring him, that he could get to the point where he could self-regulate himself to the point where he ended up relaxing enough to be able to fall asleep. Whereas my second son, he could not regulate his emotions. And as a parent, I do just want to like say like, this might be a preview if you're experiencing that with one of your kids, of the fact that they cannot cry down, they only escalate up, that this might be a preview of what's to come. So maybe we'll talk about that in future conversations. So what did it look like when I did go in and check on my first son that I was using the Ferber method with? So the main point of the Ferber method is that you're not trying to, when you go in and check on your child, you're not trying to get to them to the point where they're not crying at all. You're just trying to get to them to the point that they realize that you're still present, you're still there, you're not abandoning them. They feel confident in your response, not necessarily the fact that you are getting them to the point where they're no longer crying and basically retucked back into bed. And like completely calm and they're not having an emotional crying reaction. You're just going in to reassure them that you're still there and responding to their needs. So for me, that looked like, because he was like most babies, sleeping in his crib, sometimes he would be standing up, sometimes he would be laying down. So if he was standing up, I would go back in there. I would say, hey, like I'm reassuring him with my voice, a very calm, response, like, hey, you're safe, I'm here, it's time for bed. If he was standing up, I would basically like just, put him back into bed. I made the decision I was not going to pick him up because I didn't want him to then like have to reset every single time the cycle. Like I just wanted him to know like, hey, he can cry. I might rub his back for a few minutes, but I did not stay in his room until he was done crying, because he is crying down. He's regulating himself into a self-soothe state where he can go back to sleep. I would repeat those steps every single interaction that I had with him. It did not take very long until he felt reassurance and knowing like that he would actually like, when I would put him to bed and I would leave, he might like fuss or cry a little bit, but it's almost like he was like crying himself, not crying himself to sleep, in the fact that like when you think of cry to sleep, you're thinking of this child wailing and screaming and just like being completely terrified, but they're abandoned in their room. He would cry himself to sleep almost like he was like vocally verbalizing that it was time to go to bed. I don't know if that makes any sense, but just more of just like you know how sometimes when your kids or your babies just kind of like, they're not fussing, but they're not babbling, but it's kind of in between. Like you can tell that they're tired and they're just kind of like crying, but they're not crying because they need you. They're just crying because they're tired, and they're just like, the best way to describe it is like he got to the point where even if he was put to bed, he might fuss, but he might fuss to the point that I know like, and he knows, and I could recognize from his fussing that he's like, oh, I'm fussing because I'm tired and I'm just upset that I'm not asleep yet. But the fussing would fade out to the point where then he was asleep. And that's how the process that, because he cried down, that was the process we used to help him sleep train and help him know that he could self-soothe, he could feel assured that we would respond to his needs, that he knew we were there, he knew we were present, and he felt assurance that even though he was alone in his room, that we as parents and me as his mom, I was still responding to him, and that he knew that I was there. He had confidence and assurance in how I was going to respond to him. So he built more trust in the relationship and knowing that it was safe for him to sleep. Let's talk about the situation if you have a child where they cry up and the situation becomes more and more escalated as you're trying to figure out how do you teach them how to self-soothe. So I, as a secondary mom now with my second child, my second son, I'm like, oh, I totally got this. We're going to use the same routine. We're going to use the same method. Like, it'll just take him a little bit longer to figure it out. But as long as I stick to my guns and I, repeat my same actions, like, he'll eventually get it, right? Like, I'm the parent. I know what's best for my child, and he's going to, adjust his behavior to meet what I determine as the mom. That was not the case at all. And that's why I want to say, when you're going through this as a parent, you know what is right or what is not right for your child. And I think for me as a young mom, as a first time mom, I was like, oh, this is what works. This is what I'm going to do. This is my expectation. And we're just going to make it work for our family. And now after having a second kid, and I think this is probably why as moms have more kids, they just become more just whatever works. Your kids are completely different. You figure out how to handle one child. It might be different than how you handle another child because it's what your child needs. So kind of knowing and going into realizing that I needed to adjust my behavior as a parent, as a mom with my second was super helpful. I tried the same technique and it did not go well. Like I said, he cried himself up to the point where I was like, okay, I need to intervene for the best safety of my child because I don't want him hyperventilating. I don't want him becoming so hysterical that this is just if this is not peaceful for me or for anyone else in my family. So this is not the route that we need to take. Both of my sons, when I was trying to sleep train them, one of the big rules, one of the big recommendations is to put them to sleep drowsy, but not fully asleep. And I could really do that with my first son, but with my second son, it was a little bit harder because if I would just put him in his bed, and he was still, if he was not drowsy enough, then he would escalate to the point where then he's, up screaming and yelling and crying and having a hysteric fit. Our kind of routine ended up being that his brother would go to bed and he would stay up because he had, a night feeding. And this ended up being I think it was around 10, maybe 10:30. And so after his night feeding, I would let him fall asleep pretty much on my chest. He's burped. I'm in a rocking chair. My husband and I are still very much awake and alert. And at this point, he is almost asleep completely, or he is just on the verge of falling completely asleep. When I would put him in his crib, if it woke him up to the point that he ended up being really alert to the point that I knew that he would end up crying because he cried up, I also stood over him, again, repeating a lot of the similarities that I would do with my first son, saying you're safe, it's time for bed, mommy and daddy are here, it's time to go to sleep. All of those verbal cues to let him know that we are going to respond to his needs. We are his parents. We are here to protect him. He is safe. He's cared for. He's loved. And he is in an environment where he can go to sleep, but we are going to respond to him if he has a need. Because he was not the type of baby that I could let him fuss down. And so sometimes that meant that I was still at his bedside, rubbing his back and making sure that he was completely asleep before I left. I think that my son specifically did better with this method because he needed to have that reassurance, and because he was emotionally regulating himself off of me as his parent or off of his dad as his parent, he needed to have that physical assurance that we were there and that he wasn't abandoned. Now, I don't know specifically why he is this way. I don't know if it's a character trait. One thing that was very surprising for me, because when he would wake up at night, he would immediately cry loudly. And for a long time, we would have to go in there and start the process over. And because his process to get him back into bed, being like back comforted into bed where he could fall asleep, and he would feel reassured, and that he wasn't waking up anyone else, because that was a longer process for him than it was for my firstborn son. We finally got to the point where we realized, like, maybe he is feeling abandoned because he's not having that physical presence that he knows that he's not alone. So at this point in time, he was sleeping separate from my first son. So they were in completely separate rooms. And then, we had our room. So we had decided, like, let's just test out and see how they do sharing a room together. Because when he would wake up at night, he would, look around, he would see that, he was alone, and then he would immediately cry. And my thought process was, maybe if he wakes up and he's able to see that someone else is in the room with him, even if it's not us, like if it's his older brother, then maybe he won't feel like he's been completely abandoned, and he will know, like, oh, he is safe, he is with someone else that he can emotionally regulate off of, to say, like, oh, he's sleeping. And my first son slept so soundly. He slept all the way through the night. It was amazing. Not from a baby, but at this point in his life, he was and still is, like, a very deep, hard sleeper. Whereas, like, my second son is more of a light sleeper and will wake up more often. So my thought process was, okay, if he's waking up more often, if he can see that his brother is in his room next to him and sleeping safely, peacefully, soundly, maybe then he'll recognize and know, like, oh, my brother is with me, my brother is safe, he's sleeping, so then I can go back to sleep. And as a parent, I was like, if it goes horribly, we can always change back. You know what I mean? Like, if it's not working out for us, if it's not working out for my first son, because I didn't want his sleep to get super interrupted either, because I knew he needed his sleep. Like, hey, we can go back and we can, revert back to them being in separate rooms again. So that's what we tried. And I was floored at how well it actually worked. And I think having just like that natural reassurance that he is not alone, with seeing that his brother was there, they ended up sharing a room since that experience. Because I thought for sure, I was like, oh no, he's gonna wake up because he's a baby, and he's gonna start crying because that's been his experience in his nursery, and then it's gonna end up waking up my eldest son. And I also wasn't super sure how the morning was going to go, because one of them always woke up before the other one. And I was like, then their whole sleep cycle is going to be off, with one waking up really earlier than the other one. The other one's not going to get enough sleep. But it ended up actually creating this really fun, like, camaraderie between them, because when one would wake up, the other one would end up waking up, very relatively close at the same time. But then they ended up entertaining each other, which meant that my husband and I were able to get a little extra sleep, because they're both super happy and super content with each other, entertaining each other, versus like being in separate rooms that as soon as they woke up, they were just like, I'm ready to be with you because I don't want to be alone. So I do hope that, that something in our conversation did give you some ideas, or at least help you feel like more confident and reassured that you can choose what it is that you need to do that's best for your family, and, make adjustments to whatever method or like system you try to implement. But I would say that whatever you do decide to do, and you decide to, try, make sure you give yourself enough time to evaluate, is it really working for you or is it not working for you? Because our kids do find reassurance when we respond in the same manner, in the same way. It gives them confidence to know how we are going to react. So if you tried one method one night and you're like, oh, that doesn't work, and then you try a different method a different night and they're like, oh, that doesn't work, and then you try a separate method a different night, like, our kids end up being super confused. Like, they can't verbally communicate that. They aren't logically aware of that. But because you're not responding the same way as a parent, it ends up confusing them to know what they can expect or trust because you're not responding the same way to them every single time they're in that scenario and circumstance. So I would encourage you that whatever method you decide to try it at least for 3 or 4 nights in a row before you change your mind and start reacting to them differently, because you need some history with them to know, like, okay, is this actually working? Does this feel right? Or is this not really the right method that feels right or actually makes sense for us? I would be super curious, and I would love it if you would come back to this episode and let us know, like, what worked for you, what didn't work for you, what other thoughts or experiences do you have, so that we can help another mom that may be coming across this episode, because really all of our experiences kind of create this like beautiful culmination of wisdom for all of the other moms trying to figure this out for their own families. Now, if you have a question or a topic for a future episode, I would love if you would either drop that in the comments or use the link in the description to submit it anonymously. But if you are just feeling that you're constantly second guessing every decision, you just kind of wish that your baby had come with an instruction manual, because that would have been so much simpler, then you might find some encouragement in another episode. I will link that up for you next. But until we hang out again, I do hope you create a home that your heart loves.